Dr. Eddie Michel is a research associate in both the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies and the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Pretoria. He is furthermore an Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Fellow of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. Dr. Michel is the author of The White House and White Africa, which was published by Routledge in 2018. And Washington's response to Rhodesian UDI will be the subject he will discuss with us today.
Okay, Eddie, great to speak to you. Please tell us about your background, your research, and what led you ultimately to the White House and White Africa, and what Washington's policy towards Rhodesian UDI as being your topic.
Well, I first became interested in history during my master's at UNM, the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. I was more focused on borderlands history, Southwest history, law enforcement in the American West. But then as I continued my research and into my PhD, I became more interested in US foreign policy, and particularly the various dynamics that shaped US foreign policy, both domestic and global. Particularly, I became interested in how geopolitics and race worked together and opposed each other during the design of foreign policy, and this led me to sub-Saharan Africa and interest in the white minority rule and U.S. foreign policy toward both Rhodesia and also apartheid era South Africa. I was particularly interested, as I said, how these various determinants interacted with each other and shaped policy.
And then, of course, the infamous moment was UDI, the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. Could you tell us historically, why was it so controversial, and how did it isolate the Rhodesian state?
Well, as it was highly controversial, as you mentioned, because it was a white minority government claiming to take independence. Illegally in the British view, taking independence in order to preserve white minority rule, which of course was the complete opposite to what the Black liberation movements and Black African nations would regard as independence. So you had a small white minority in control of the country, illegally defying both the United Kingdom and the UN and the world to declare its own independence in order to preserve its privileged position within its nation. They, of course, saw it somewhat differently. They saw it as an action against, to avoid the spread of communism, which they associated Black political activity, in a Manichaean sense, with a devious international communist plot. They also saw the chaos and upheaval in many of the newly independent Black African states, and in their view said so far and no further.
So the moment of UDI is the 11th of November, 1965, and the American president there, 1 year into his administration, Kennedy assassination is 63, isn't it? So a couple of years in, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he's first tasked with developing a policy response towards UDI. What was it?
LBJ, as you correctly say, was president at the time of the UDI. His approach was of balanced hostility, that throughout the tortuous negotiations that preceded UDI, Washington followed the British line and placed, I would say, more pressure on Salisbury to agree to the British terms, or at least avoid a UDI. Following the UDI, it was a question of how much pressure LBJ was actually able to exert on Salisbury. But specifically, the fact that both South Africa and Portugal a key NATO ally, and South Africa very important strategically and economically for the United States, were consistently violating the UN sanctions were imposed on Salisbury. And LBJ, while urging them to abide by such sanctions, was reluctant to openly confront them. Domestically also, it was quite a controversial issue. Obviously, the African American community associated continued white supremacy in Southern Africa with what had happened in the Southern United States. And so they saw direct parallels, and they wanted the US government to take a firm stance. Nevertheless, many of Johnson's key political allies, conservative Democrats such as Jim Eastland, governor of Mississippi, and others, they saw Rhodesia both on racial lines, they understood, and identified with people like Ian Smith. And they also they saw no reason for the United States to engage in overtly hostile actions against what they believed to be a democratic, Western-leaning, anti-communist nation.
Oh, goodness, because this is a very particular moment in American politics. This is the time of the civil rights movement, as you say, and then, of course, all the pushback that comes with it. So to what extent do you think does this play into, the civil rights revolution as it's, as it's unfolding in the United States?
I think it plays into both sides, as I mentioned, of the civil rights revolution. Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders certainly identified with the plight of oppressed blacks in Rhodesia, and they wanted the U.S. government to take a firmer stance. On the other side, as I mentioned, both for racial reasons and just generally more conservative reasons in terms of economics and geopolitics, you had a large number, I would say the majority of Americans, identifying with Rhodesia. And both historically in the sense that Rhodesia was the first country after the United States to unilaterally declare its independence from the United Kingdom. So there was that historical link. There was also the frontier link, the idea of taming the wilderness. Rhodesia's manifest destiny, if you will, and that certainly played in to thinking of many conservative Americans. As I mentioned already, race played a role. Economic interest and geopolitics for those more worldly savvy Americans. At that point, they were aware that opposing Rhodesia seemed to be on the wrong side of history. You were isolated, especially after Rhodesia offered tangible help in Vietnam, whereas the British, of course, were more difficult in Vietnam. Not only didn't offer assistance, but British flag vessels were trading with North Vietnamese. So it seemed that the Rhodesians were the anti-communist friends of the United States, whereas Britain, was a power that wasn't actually helping us out too much. Therefore, why should we help them with this issue they created in the view of LBJ and many in his cabinet in sub-Saharan Africa? So therefore, there was all of these sort of strange tensions which pushed and pulled the LBJ administration in different directions.
But would it not have been the worldly savvy ones who would have been able to identify where on the map of Central Africa Rhodesia is? Was there a sort of Main Street rallying towards the Rhodesian cause? I would imagine that the majority on both sides of the civil rights struggle might not be able to identify who Ian Smith or Joshua Nkomo were. Or are we wrong there in terms of the issue's penetration into everyday American life?
Presidential correspondence reveals an enormous amount of support for Ian Smith across the nation, from the Deep South to I would describe as fairly moderate Democrats in California and other places. There was certainly, they felt that he was being badly treated by the world. He was being badly treated by America. In terms of Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, I don't think anybody in America had heard of them before, other than the most involved, let's say, Africa watchers at the State Department and so on at the UN. But Smith certainly became very symbolic of Rhodesia. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of presidential correspondence which was written to LBJ supportive of Ian Smith. Why are we taking such hostile actions against someone who fought on our side during World War II? There were enormous numbers of quite bizarre groups that came up to support in support of Rhodesia. There was, I'm trying to think, there was certainly the Friends of Rhodesia, which had hundreds of thousands, I believe, supporters. There were other quite bizarre ones, including, if memory serves me correct, the Rhodesia Gung-Ho Troops and Hooray for Ian Smith, Titan of Rhodesian Yearning, which someone had a very active imagination there. But so in short, public support among most Americans, particularly white Americans who were the majority and remain the majority, was strongly in favor of Ian Smith. Obviously, certain civil rights figures connected what was going on in Rhodesia with, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act in the Deep South, and a desire to remove oppressive white supremacy wherever it might be in the world. But certainly the American public correspondence in the 1960s, presidential correspondence, reveals a surprising amount of support for Ian Smith, which of course factors into any politician's decision making.
What I find fascinating here, it's almost like the playbook for white minority regimes in Africa in terms of how to appeal to the United States and seek US protection, because the apartheid regime sent troops to Korea in the 1950s,
Yeah.
and also framed themselves as anti-communist crusaders. So that would be my next question, is how did the dynamics of the Cold War influence the relationship between the White House and Rhodesia?
Well, you certainly hit on an important theme there, that both the apartheid regime and Salisbury, which we're talking about today, used anti-communist propaganda to influence the White House, to influence American public. And they played on that we are pro-Western, we are anti-communist, we are here to support you, and we have supported you. The Rhodesian Information Office, which was a quasi-embassy in Washington, distributed large amounts of propaganda, emphasizing the vehement anti-communism of the Rhodesians. And though what I would say is, I sense that Salisbury did actually believe a lot of its own propaganda. And I think Pretoria to the same extent. So to what extent this was things they believed they were and they wanted America to know, and to what extent it was disseminating false propaganda is very hard to say. But certainly the white regimes and Salisbury played on the vehement anti-communism. Of course, other factors came into that from the US perspective as well. In the case of South Africa, the Cape Sea route, the vast natural resources, many of which were deemed crucial and essential by the Office of Emergency Preparedness, which brings me back to Rhodesia. I keep going down a little bit south of the border, but in the case of Rhodesia, Chrome, of course, played, which I understand we'll be talking about a little bit, played a major role in shaping US foreign policy during the Nixon era. Again, because it was on the list of critical and essential minerals. What I'm driving at is natural resources, and the strategic positioning of both Rhodesia and South Africa played an enormous role in shaping US thinking toward the white minority regimes from the 1950s all the way up into the 1980s and the Reagan era.
I want to speak about the transition from, before we get to Chrome, about the transition from Johnson to Richard Nixon. And people who are really fundies about this subject will know about the Tar Baby National Security Memorandum of 1969. What was that, and how did it reposition American foreign policy towards Southern Africa generally and Rhodesia within that context?
Well, National Security Decision Memorandum 38, which was the Tar Baby option Anthony Lake was referring to, moved the United States toward closer ties, termed limited association, with both Pretoria and Salisbury. Nixon came into office determined to reshape U.S. foreign policy and put U.S. interests first. And not, there's a famous quote which I will probably mangle, but somewhere along the lines that we must analyze our national interest and not worry too much about other people's domestic policies. And this applied to Nixonian foreign policy across the globe, not just in sub-Saharan Africa. And a lot of this was shaped by Henry Kissinger, his hugely influential Secretary of State. And he analyzed countries according to their worth and their weight, their strength on the global scale. And he saw the white minority regimes as stable, solidly pro-Western, and particularly in the case of South Africa, as I said, the most powerful military in the African continent, and that gave a lot of weight to his thinking, as opposed to the Black African states, which he regarded as politically immature, weak economies, and militarily insignificant. So what I'm really driving at is American interest came first, both economic and strategic interest, and that defined Nixon's policymaking. And certainly that's reflected in NSDM 38, where it didn't matter how unsavory a regime was, as long as they were pro-American and useful, then Nixon was happy to have closer ties. However, he didn't opt for full normalization, which what former Secretary of State Dean Acheson asked for and pushed for, full normalization with Rhodesia, recognition. He realized that would be too politically damaging, both at the UN and with the Brits in London.
Well, I can't I can't help but see the parallels because we have the exact same debates today around US foreign policy and rare earth minerals at the moment. And again, pro-America and useful. So that does bring us straight to Chrome. And why this led the US to place itself in violation of UN sanctions. Please do tell.
Well, chromium, without getting too much into the science, is a critical and essential mineral used in numerous industries, including chemical manufacturing, automotive industry, used by NASA in the space program. So it is deemed by the United States to be a critical and essential mineral. The problem faced then and now by Washington is that chromium is not equally distributed in the Earth's crust. It's placed in, it appears in a few key places, including sub-Saharan Africa, Turkey, and particularly relevant back in the 1970s, the USSR. So Rhodesia was an important source of chromite ore for numerous industries in the United States. And when the United States willingly placed itself under UN sanctions, the main source of chromium then became the USSR, which is a poor idea geostrategically for obvious reasons we don't get into. But the Soviets exploited this and raised their prices as well, while it's alleged importing Rhodesian chrome themselves for their own domestic consumption. On top of that, Soviet chrome is of inferior quality. So there were a number of reasons why this became a focal issue by the early 1970s, particularly because US chrome reserves were running low. And the Office of Emergency Preparedness, which I mentioned a few times, the OEP, was particularly concerned about this, as was Treasury, as was Commerce, as was Defense. So Nixon had a lot of officials coming to him and saying, hey, look, we've got a problem with this chrome. He also had businessmen coming to him and saying, look, we can't create the same products we used to do because we're dependent on Soviet chrome. We want access to Rhodesian chrome. And obviously the US mining industry, well, I say obviously, but the US mining industry was very active as well in Rhodesia. Union Carbide, Foot Mineral were major owners of mines in Rhodesia. So there was a lot of domestic pressure on Nixon to do something. But ironically, it wasn't Nixon who actually allowed this to happen. It was Congress. And to cut a long story short, legislation came through, which was attached to a defense appropriations bill, which allowed the United States to import a number of strategic and critical minerals from Rhodesia if it was also importing the same critical and strategic mineral from a communist state. So this placed the United States in violation of UN sanctions, but it also made, from an American perspective, made good sense. This is obviously the Byrd Amendment, it was called, or Section 503, as that was the amendment to the Defense Appropriations Bill. It was highly controversial. Nonetheless, Nixon signed it, and behind the scenes, he was quite eager for Congress to pass this legislation. In fact, when the UN censored him, or there was UN criticism, he threatened to cut off funding to the UN because this was such an important national security issue for the United States. So in short, that was that was the chrome issue. U.S. willingly placed itself in violation of UN sanctions in defense of its own geostrategic and economic interest. I believe there was a direct quote from Nixon that something along the lines of, "We don't care about the UN, we want to buy this goddamn chrome."
Another thing again, that seems to be very, very America first. Now, in terms of his doctrine in many ways. Also, but I want to speak about the pivot of the Cold War. Understand that the leak of the Tar Baby report, it's around September 1974, but then the Cold War has changed by then, and I think it's almost, if not the end of Nixon's administration, with Watergate around then in 1974. I want to speak about a number of things coming together. Vietnam, and the end of America's war there, Watergate, and also the collapse of the Portuguese Empire and the emergence of Angola. So we've got a changing world order. How do those, and if you can think of any other factors which are important, how does the changing of the Cold War, that sort of move towards détente, the early stage, how does it affect the relationship in the Nixon-Ford era of the mid-1970s? You can even include the visit to China as well, just anything. How does that relationship change around 1974, 1975?
I think there are you highlighted two key factors there. I think the détente with China was less important for sub-Saharan Africa. Certainly Watergate, the removal of the calculating America first, if you will, Nixon, and replaced by the more moralistic Gerald Ford, made a huge difference. Ford joined the NAACP back in the 1950s, which is quite remarkable for a white Michigander. And had a genuine commitment to racial equality, both in the United States and overseas. He was on record as saying we have a moral duty to bring an end to white minority rule in Rhodesia. And this wasn't just rhetoric for public consumption. He also stated this privately in National Security Council meetings. So the removal of Nixon and his replacement by Ford was a big deal. Obviously, geostrategically, the collapse of the Portuguese Empire and the independence of Mozambique and Angola in particular, which I'll get onto, was of concern to the United States because they perceived it as an opportunity, which it was, for the communists to expand their influence in sub-Saharan Africa. And the fact that Mozambique leaned Marxist, and of course there was a civil war erupted in Angola, which I'll get right onto, where the main group was a Marxist group. The US then, of course, involved itself in the South African invasion and connived with Pretoria in an attempt to overthrow the MPLA in Luanda. CIA were active in that particular invasion in 1975, 1976. The fact that failed, and failed in part because US Congress and the media outlets became aware of US involvement, and in the aftermath of, to bring it back to Vietnam, in the aftermath of the Vietnam era, US foreign involvement in another faraway land at US taxpayer expense was frowned upon. And then particularly after, again, the South Africans withdrew, they felt abandoned by the US, which Congress passed legislation preventing any further assistance to the South Africans in Angola, or any US involvement in Angola, I should clarify that. That, of course, both domestically made us look foolish and it made us look weak globally. And there was a desire to let's have no more Vietnams. But at the same time, let's avoid any situations which could become like another Vietnam, which then brings us back to Rhodesia. And having Angola fallen to the MPLA, Mozambique under Marxist rule, there was a concern, where will the Soviets and Cubans go next? What will they be looking at? Which is the next weak, precarious state in sub-Saharan Africa? And the obvious target was Rhodesia. There was a growing guerrilla insurgency. White immigration was increasing. Smith's regime was increasingly embattled. And there was concern that if the Cubans and Soviets turn their attention to Rhodesia, that it'll become even more of an international cause célèbre than it currently was, because the US would be placed in an unenviable position of either having to intervene to support a white minority regime against the Soviets, or just accept that Rhodesia will fall. And then, of course, from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, virtually, you would have a whole swathe of Marxist influence. And again, also, which would pose a threat to South Africa itself, of course, which is South African Vorster, whose name I probably horribly mangled, was well aware of that. And that was brought to when Vorster met with Kissinger in Grafenau, he made this point. So there was, US was placed in quite an unenviable position due to this trifecta of events that Tula mentioned. And so Ford decided for the first time to place the authority of the United States government behind the goal of majority rule in Rhodesia, which of course was Kissinger's famous speech in Lusaka, Zambia, where he said the United States is for majority rule and we'll do everything we can essentially to bring this about. He then engaged in his famous shuttle diplomacy and got all parties together. He met with the South Africans, he met with the frontline states, he met with the British to make sure there was a plan all the key players agreed to. He then presented that as a fait accompli to Smith, who said, I believe famously, when one has a gun pointed to his head, it leaves very little room for equivocation. which I thought was quite a nice quote. Under U.S. pressure, Smith both privately and publicly accepted the need for majority rule. Of course, we know what happened next. There was a Geneva conference, which became a huge debacle, and all sides unwilling to compromise. But I think the key point there is, perhaps to wrap this section up, is it was the first time that the United States placed its diplomatic, economic, and geopolitical power behind the goal of majority rule in Rhodesia. And even though it failed initially then, it set the groundwork for the Carter era's later initiatives and the end of UDI.
Before Lindy steps in, where's Britain? I mean, Britain was supposed to be the custodian. It was the one leading in 1965, saying that they were the key interlocutor. Where are they? What's happened to them by 1975? Why is America the one defining what happens here?
Certainly, Britain took a step back. There was renewed energy from renewed energy. There was a sudden burst of impetus and energy in the Ford era. We must fix this because of the when it was a minor problem to do with white minority rule versus black majority rule, and it was more something that you would, how can I put it, an irritant in the global affairs rather than something which could lead to a broader geopolitical problem. The United States was quite happy to step back. And in case of Nixon, he was just really disinterest and apathy. He was not particularly, he couldn't, other than getting the Chrome and it not rocking the boat in terms of other things, there was disinterest and apathy. Under Ford, suddenly there was this threat of the Cuban and Soviet power in sub-Saharan Africa, and Cuban military power exhibited itself in Angola. And I think that brought, it elevated, if you will, Rhodesia from being a primarily British problem to being a Western geopolitical problem, at which point America, as the leader of the free world, or perceived leader of the free world, took over. Britain was certainly there. I mean, Kissinger engaged in numerous talks with the British in London. He was also dispatched by, I believe it was Callahan, to sub-Saharan Africa. And so, he's American, but he's speaking for both Britain and the United States. So Britain was certainly involved, as was South Africa. Forster and Kissinger met twice in Grafenau and also, the name escapes me, somewhere else in Western Europe. But this was important because it was the first time that a South African head of state had met a U.S. Secretary of State since Stettinius met Smuts. So this itself was a major diplomatic event for really for South Africa, but also just generally. But I moved away from Britain too, as I got more interested in what South Africa was doing. But yes, I mean, the U.S. certainly began to involve itself, and Britain took more of a minor role, and this continued during the Carter era. It wasn't that the U.S. did all the running and Britain fell in the slipstream, but the U.S. became a lot more involved, and not just simply going to London, what do you think we should do? It became a Western problem rather than just a British problem.
Right.
Well, I will say for the record, you pronounce Forster's name perfectly. Absolutely no problem.
That's good to know.
But something else that interests me, and again, I can't help but see the parallels, is you have these former liberation movements that later become governing parties. And you have the US throwing its weight behind them in the final years of their struggle. And yet today you see these very tense relationships. So I would actually like to know, in the case of Rhodesia, what were the relations between the White House and the liberation movements, ZANU and ZAPU?
Before I just get into that, what I would say is, I suspect, from the perspective of the liberation movements, even though really, I think both in Rhodesia and South Africa, without U.S. hostility in the end toward Ian Smith and the apartheid regime, there may not have been an end to white minority rule. So I think they do forget that. However, that said, I would imagine it was a question of too little too late, or at least just too late. In terms of ZAPU and ZANU, under the LBJ administration, there was no contact, as far as I'm aware. Nixon certainly wasn't interested at all in any contact. He was barely interested in meeting Black African leaders at all. So certainly not the liberation movements. Contact began with State Department officials under Jerry Ford. Kissinger met with Nkomo in, I believe, Lusaka, and he was very impressed. Joshua Nkomo, that is. He's described Joshua Nkomo as unquestionably the best and most Western-oriented liberation leader in Zimbabwe. They didn't meet with Mugabe at this point, though U.S. officials did meet with Mugabe later on, particularly at the Geneva conference. They were not impressed by Mugabe. They regarded him as intransigent. They thought he would, if he came to power, it would lead to Zimbabwe becoming a Marxist dictatorship with no future for the white community, which some might say was very prophetic. But certainly they were impressed by Nkomo. Under Jimmy Carter, I'm not sure whether getting to Jimmy Carter or not, there were much more meetings between State Department officials. Andy Young famously met with Mugabe and Nkomo on Malta and got on great with them. That's UN Ambassador Andy Young, former civil rights activist. He got on great with them. I believe they might have even gone swimming together, or possibly for a jog. But again, it was later on under Ford and Carter that U.S. officials started to really engage with them, which was not quite the same as the ANC in South Africa. That Kennedy, for example, sent a letter to Albert Luthuli congratulating him on his Nobel Peace Prize. And there were various meetings between Luthuli and, I believe, Ambassador back in the 60s. So in the case of South Africa, which I know we're not talking about, U.S. outreach, if you will, to the ANC came a lot earlier than it did in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia, Zimbabwe.
If Smith has got the gun to his head and he's got no choice, why is the war continuing? I just want us to pick up that thread. I understand there's talks at Victoria Falls, which are quite famous. You've mentioned Geneva talks. Mentioned about other talks. What's breaking down when they're meeting? What's going wrong? Why isn't there a settlement?
What Smith was referring to was he met in Pretoria with Vorster and Kissinger. I believe they also caught a rugby game at Loftus, which I'm sure he enjoyed that, although perhaps a little more uncomfortable in his seat than usual, given the conversations he'd had earlier. I believe what Smith was referring to is that while Vorster was next to Kissinger, he threatened to cut off all South African military aid unless Smith did engaged in meetings with the black nationalists on the grounds that Kissinger had proposed. So what Smith was referring to, given the dependence of Rhodesia upon South Africa, both economically but also militarily in terms of hardware, that he was being cut off. So I think his phrase, having a gun held to your head gives no room for equivocation, was in direct response to being squeezed on one side by Kissinger, on the other by Vorster.
And then Jimmy Carter. He was the president during the decisive phase of the relationship in the late 70s. And did he dovetail his diplomacy alongside Britain's?
Absolutely, yeah. More so than perhaps Jerry Ford did. There was the Anglo-American Initiative, which was basically the idea was to get everybody moving in the direction. It wasn't a proposal as such, but it was more, let's keep prodding the liberation movements. Let's keep prodding Smith, continuing to turn the screws on Smith. Let's keep the South Africans putting pressure on Smith. So everybody, and the British as well, well, of course the British was the Anglo-American plan, excuse me. But the idea was to keep turning the screws slowly on everybody so that inch by inch they would come closer together for a settlement. And of course, they worked later on at Lancaster House. While that was a primarily British affair, Americans hadn't quite diplomacy involved itself. What I would also say, while there was the dovetailing, there were also moments when America pushed harder than Britain did to bring about black majority rule in Rhodesia, particularly when Bishop Muzorewa came to power. And there was this government of national unity, which Margaret Thatcher came very close to accepting. Jimmy Carter, of course, opposed this. He regarded it as a charade. And it was his refusal to recognize the GNU or lift sanctions that led Thatcher to also say, okay, look, we're not going to recognize this, which then led to Lancaster House and, of course, the arrival of true majority rule.
So, Eddie, when we come to the end game in Rhodesia, when it ceases to be and it becomes Zimbabwe, does the United States feel as though it has a dog in that election fight? Does it have any preference between Mugabe, Nkomo, and Muzorewa? Because from what you're saying previously, it seems as though they might well have.
Well, certainly Jimmy Carter, Jerry Ford, his administration disliked Mugabe. Carter was more tolerant. I think what Carter wanted was an end to the conflict, the arrival of what he saw as true majority rule. He was perhaps a little more naive in his views of Robert Mugabe than the Ford administration, and I think they would have favored Nkomo, and certainly documents suggest Nkomo or another more moderate figure coming to power, but certainly upon Mugabe's electoral victory, there was no particular concern among the Carter administration. Indeed, he was elated that the people of Zimbabwe had finally achieved majority rule, and Mugabe was swiftly invited for a state dinner at the White House. The date eludes me, but only a few months after his electoral victory. So there wasn't, there wasn't any of the concerns that were raised by Jerry Ford or the State Department under Henry Kissinger. Even though, despite repeated warnings from South Africa, and of course South Africa was meddling north of its border in that particular election, and repeatedly said to that Mugabe could win and Mugabe would cause a problem, but Jimmy Carter was probably not eager to listen to Pretoria anyway for various other reasons. So the relations were pretty low during the Carter era. But in short, no, there was no immediate concerns about Robert Mugabe or what might happen to Zimbabwe under his rule during Jimmy Carter's era, during the Jimmy Carter administration.
Well, I will say I am now picturing Mugabe in that tuxedo at the state dinner at the White House. So
I'm sure I'll find a photo to send to you.
I'd love to see it. I can just imagine it. So would you say, if we say we have with that picture in our minds, would you say idealism and realism combined in shaping the White House's policy towards Rhodesia, in this period from 1965 to 1980?
I would prefer to use the terms pragmatism and morality. I think that throughout that 15-year or 14-year period of the UDI, pragmatism and morality often conflicted in U.S. foreign policy, but sometimes came together, as I said when we began, to achieve mutually acceptable goals. Certainly during the Ford and Carter eras, you can see pragmatism and morality coming together. With Nixon, I think we could safely say that pragmatism trumped morality. So yes, certainly where I would talk about pragmatism, talking about economic interest and geopolitical considerations. Where I'm talking about morality is obviously racial equality and the coming about of majority rule. So you can see, there was conflict, and yet there were moments when these, what one would imagine are mutually unacceptable goals, actually they came together to achieve a mutually acceptable goal, particularly during the Carter and Ford era, when it became clear that Rhodesia was now a problem. Rather than an ally against the communist threat, the very presence of the white minority rule was actually exacerbating, communist interference in sub-Saharan Africa, encouraging it, stimulating it. And I think that's when Rhodesia went from being, we should support these guys because they're vehemently anti-communist, look, they volunteered to help us in Vietnam, they've got some rare earth minerals we like, to actually these guys are the problem now. And that's most clear and with Henry Kissinger, where, he was the architect of NSDM 38, that push toward closer ties, limited association as it was termed, yet only 2 or 3 years later, he was saying, I'm trying to think of his quote now. Something along the lines of, while I have great empathy for the white Rhodesians, in the name of geopolitical, political interest, they must go, even though it makes me sad to so do. But by go, he meant, of course, the removal of the white minority rule, not the white population. Must clarify that.
So in conclusion, please give us a sense of the state of the literature at the moment. What are the most important books, if anybody's interested about reading, besides The White House and White Africa? Which are the key books that they should refer to?
I was hoping you'd let me plump that one.
No, we'll certainly plump that one, but the other ones besides that. Your one is central. That's why you're invited.
I appreciate that. Well, other than my own book, The White House and White Africa, I'd recommend Andy DeRoche's Black, White, and Chrome. Gerald Horne's From the Barrel of a Gun is a different take on it. He just talks about the links between, it talks about economic interest, U.S. support for Rhodesia in South Africa, whether that be economic ties, whether that be the historical linkages. And he has quite an interesting section on American mercenaries fighting in Rhodesia, and why they went, what they thought they were going to achieve there. And so his book certainly offers a different take to my work or that of Andy DeRoche.
Well, Eddie, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion. I definitely want to go and read some more about this. But thank you for enlightening us, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Oh, well, thank you for having me on your show.
Anytime. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Eddie.